Welcome to the Audio Garden. I'm glad to have you here.
It's
And
my pleasure.
Big Fiction is about how conglomeration, let me read this, conglomeration changed the publishing industry and American literature. And I've been reading it, since the weekend. Almost got to the end. I was trying to read the conclusion while I was waiting for you, but I didn't quite get there. But it's very interesting to look forward from all this. And I think the book really, for me, as a writer who's actually going through the process right now of querying publishers and so on for a second unpublished novel, um, it's been extremely informative in helping me to understand, as opposed to, I don't know, your typical guide to how to get published. It's really made me deeply understand the present publishing industry. So thank you for writing the book. And I'm looking at like the colophons now, which is something that I never paid much attention to. But I also found that the book kind of mirrored my personal experiences in different ways, where, I got enraptured with Frodo in junior high school, and I went on to read the trilogy that came after The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and not really thinking as I went through life later, like becoming enraptured with like the counter storytelling of, uh, oh, what was that book? Of the Myths of Avalon, I was
Mm.
thinking about, which told King Arthur from, a different point of view and was like fantasy also. And, from my point of view, then fantasy just kind of always existed as a genre, you know? And then later on in the 90s, I was a young single mother and I was working, both doing a radio show where I was talking to multicultural authors who publishers were happily trying to get me to have on my show. And I was also working for a not for profit in the East Village Fly by Night Press, a gathering of the tribes. And people like Paul Beatty and Ishmael Reed were hanging out there regularly. But I was helping to write grants where those were key words: multiculturalism. We had to, say all these things. And whether or not we got the grant was kind of dependent on how we put all that together. And so this has kind of opened my mind. And I wondered if you could talk just from the point of view of a writer, how conglomeration is sitting on that page, that query letter they're writing, the one or two pages where they have to make a pitch. They have to choose, tell these people the genre they're writing in, point out like some comparable titles, and then, you know, somehow make that sound marketable. And that was kind of the story of going from corporate to conglomerates, which maybe I always confused in my mind as almost the same thing.
Yeah. So if you're querying today as an author in 2024, what you're facing in terms of the publishing industry is drastically different than it was several decades ago. And that's really the story that my book tells. So if you were writing back in the 1960s and you wanted to get in touch with an editor, for one, you could just write to a publishing house. So Cormac McCarthy sent his manuscript for his first novel into Random House directly, and they ended up publishing it. It got in the hands of an editor who liked it. Now, obviously, you can't do that anymore because sometime in the subsequent decades, these publishing houses, which were at the time relatively small, relatively independent. They were often owned by the founders or the heirs of the founders. They were a little bit more flexible in how they ran their business operations and the kind of books they might take or not take. But starting in, especially in the 1970s, large conglomerates, which are they're companies that hold multiple companies within them, often from different sectors of the industry at once. So RCA, this was one of the first ones that happened. RCA, which was a big television producing company and military industrial complex company, bought Random House in 1965. Penguin Random House is now the world's largest trade publisher. So in the 1950s, it had something like 200, 250 employees. Today, it has 10,000 employees. So you're just looking at a radically different scale of industry. And from having dozens and dozens of publishers you might go to, now 80% of trade publishing is controlled by 5 large conglomerates, several of which are owned by parent companies outside the US. And so those big 5 dominate so much of the resources and the attention economy um, within publishing today. And then outside of that 80%, there's still a very robust and lively 20% of the industry that is smaller, either independent or nonprofit publishing. And much of how a literary agent is going to read your query letter is shaped based on this structure of how the industry operates. So the big 5 are really dominated by demands for quarterly growth. And these pressures come from the C suite on down and trickle through the companies into the editors. Now, editors have a certain amount of autonomy within constraints of the decisions they can make, but those constraints are serious, and it also depends on which imprint. There are dozens and dozens of imprints at each of the big 5, and each imprint has its own kind of specialty and its own purview. And the editors at those imprints might be more commercial, they might be a little more literary, but all of the imprints at a big 5 company are going to have pressure to sell books.
And each of those editors, really, the pressure became more about them being responsible for choosing books that were going to sell as opposed to making sort of more independent or literary minded types of choices that aligned with their personal I don't want to say personal interests, like they were always trying to sell books, right? But it became less and less wiggle room to support a project that you liked, and these editors were spending more time in business meetings than they were editing books.
That's exactly right. So what we've seen is over the last several decades, gradual pressure for the big 5 to take fewer and fewer aesthetic risks. They take aesthetic risks, especially in certain imprints above others, but those risks become more and more modest as that financial pressure increases. And what you see then is you see them outsourcing, or you see there being more room for aesthetic risk at these independent, small independent and nonprofit presses, of which Spartanburg, South Carolina's Hub City Press is one of many in an increasingly vibrant sector, because the conglomerates are taking fewer chances with interesting and risky path-breaking work. There's more room for these small presses to take on that work.
Well, they actually came about in sort of answer to the conglomeration that started. I mean, it was, you point out in the book, a new thing really for not-for-profits to support literary presses. So as I brought up, my experience of doing that kind of work in the 90s was kind of when that was blossoming. But there was a rhetoric involved with that. And, I was looking at that thinking, well, so we have the not-for-profits, and we have also, in answer to that, we have like the university presses. And then we have what we call conglomerate publishing, which is actually kind of shaped almost all of that in its demand to be, I'm not sure if this is the word you used, but predictive. It wants to predict how many books are going to sell, and it wants to actually know that and be right about it. And in many ways that shaped, and what I found interesting and did not expect to find in a book about conglomeration, was that this influenced the content of what we're writing. And you point out that writers, if there is an anti-hero in this book, it would be a writer who thinks that they're actually, just a creative individual on their own who's the genius in all these things. So maybe we could get a little deeper into how, like, a writer would then think about themselves in this landscape.
Sure. So, yeah, one thing that my book really tries to emphasize as an argument is how conglomeration has changed what it means to be a literary author. Um, there are certain ideas about authors and authorship that we as a culture are really deeply and profoundly attached to. And the publishing industry has a reason to want us to continue to be attached to these ideas, these romantic ideas about authorial genius. And you have what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls an uncreated creator, someone just writing all on their own, coming up with these ideas at their writing desk in a cabin in the woods or something like that. This years that I spent investigating how publishing works today taught me that that's really a myth. That's really a kind of fantasy that we love, but isn't particularly true. Increasingly, authors are one part of a professionalized world. Writing has become increasingly professional in the United States since the 1990s, and the MFA, the Creative Writing Program, became institutionalized and offered a path towards a professional career as a writer. And every step you take along that path towards a career is set up within certain hierarchies of prestige. And so you're much more likely to find success if you're born into a wealthy zip code, are able to go be one of the few who goes to an Ivy League undergrad, manages then to get into Iowa Writers Workshop. Then your path, even then, you're not guaranteed to have literary success, but your odds are vastly superior to those of other folks. And so the entire nature of being an author today is structured along odds. And those odds are dependent so much on social networks, on credentials, and uh, that also means that authors are products and part of these networks. There's kind of like a natural selection, Darwinian process going on where certain people, there are obviously a vastly more number of authors who would like to be published than the publishing industry accepts and then celebrates. And even those that it does accept, the majority of those who get published by the big five disappear. Don't get adequate marketing or publicity resources, might get into bookshops for 4 to 6 weeks, and then their books kind of fall away. It's only a very small percent of those books that are celebrated by the big five that become big successes. The books that have success then produce a feedback loop back to the editors who are acquiring books and the literary agents who are acquiring authors and the authors who are reading books. Everyone starts to see what are the ideas, what are the genres, what are the styles, what are the forms that are working. And so this sort of implicit, unconscious, usually it's implicit and unconscious. It's seldom that people are actively, strategically trying to follow all of this and then design how they're writing on the basis of these trends, but it's just part of the water that authors are swimming in. And this water, the sort of particular pH, you might say, of this water is produced by all of these many figures, from publicists and marketers and book buyers at bookstores and CEOs and editors and agents and professors at creative writing programs. Everyone's contributing to this environment that literary authors must adapt to if they want to survive. If they don't adapt, they won't survive. And so what that means is that the author is not this sort of solitary genius in contemporary American literary life. They're someone who is part of an extraordinary large network that they're trying to have success within.
Right. And have a potential to be like a brand name where everything around the book, from movies and whatever else becomes, they're like the name of on an engine or something that's just gonna, do all this stuff. But that's maybe, 10 or 20 people that you could name, over the course of how many years. But what I also found very interesting was you talk about the content of it all comes down to that. So a writer sits down to write something that they hope that they might get a little money back on somewhere down the line, right? Or in their wild fantasy, maybe it'll be a hit. But what they're most likely to sit down and write is sort of allegorical autofiction, historical autofiction. And I realized that was true of this novel that I'm trying to sell when I said, oh, okay, well, he's helped me figure out what genre to call this, But, you talk about Beloved as being an allegory for, additionally, above the story of it being the obvious one about slavery, is also about breaking away from, publishing, the publishing world as a Toni Morrison said it was her job, not her career at the time. You quote in the book, and you also bring that to the work of Stephen King. So how are we? How should we see ourselves? Like, and how should we position ourselves as we try to do this? Okay, I mentioned the genre, but I have to go on now to the comps. So, what does this mean as a writer when you're trying to actually satisfy? You mentioned all these different titles in near the end of the book of, there's these sales managers, there's this manager, that person, and they're all trying to get down to what is going to be the bottom line. And you as a writer, you're really not trying to think about the bottom line like that.
Yeah, no, Toni Morrison and Stephen King are both particularly self-aware writers about the role that allegory plays in their work. Toni Morrison, many people don't know this, but she spent 15, 16 years working as an editor at Random House. And in the preface to Beloved, she writes that she, was able to write Beloved, or Beloved kind of came to her. She says, Beloved entered. She says, when she quit her job at Random House, and she suddenly had this feeling of being free, and it allowed her to think about freedom, which is obviously at the core of a novel about slavery, in Beloved. And there's ways in which she's working through her 15, 16 years in the publishing industry as an employee in the publishing industry in that novel. Stephen King, in his novels, he's worried about the fact that he's become a brand, that he's just become literary content, and people lose track of the idea that he's a human artist who's trying to be true to himself inside of that brand. And he writes novel after novel in the 80s and 90s about an individual artist threatened with being annihilated by the overpowering mechanisms of corporations or the source of brands. So those things they were aware of, but I don't know that it's good for writers to be aware of that most of the time. I think one of the things that writers have to be able to do to succeed is they have to be able to channel the unconscious. They have to be able to channel the personal and the collective unconscious. And what that means, how that looks, is different for every single writer. But I think more often than not, it doesn't mean trying to be aware of the fact that certain things are going to get channeled through you anyway. You might end up writing allegories for the world in which you're writing. In fact, there's a pretty good chance you will, because in order to succeed at writing, if you're a committed writer, these the sociological factors of writing are deeply built into the structure of your mind. So that those things would play out when you write, when you allow yourself to become a vessel, that those things would come through you. There's nothing surprising about that. But if you are thinking about that consciously, that might block your ability to become the channel, the vessel that you need to become. There's different phases too as a writer. There's the phase of creation when you are trying to become that source of creativity, and then there's the phase where you're trying to be the entrepreneur, where you're trying to sell and market your work. At that stage, you might want to then look back and say, is it useful to me to look for these tactics that I didn't know necessarily I was doing when I was doing it, but are clearly there? Maybe now I want to take a hold of that and use that in my attempt to market my work, query my work, get it published.
I think that is exactly how I was feeling and what I was pointing to when I started this conversation about feeling like this is a great guide, because it did actually lead me in my own work to think about, oh, yes, okay, I've got the genre settled. And just kind of understand the landscape and not have unrealistic expectations, which kind of leads me to, what you hinted at, which is that, of course, whether it was corporate or conglomerate, and I would even argue, a lot of the not for profits still persisted in the universities in being extremely, white male oriented. And so, as anybody who's not one of those might wonder, but the publishing as a whole seems to be moving towards multiculturalism, and you point in your conclusion to that maybe including a more, global way of looking at, like global literature, that we're actually pretty provincial here in America in publishing, American literature and not looking at the broader scale of things. So I'm not sure if there was a question in that.
Yeah,
Maybe you
no,
want to make a comment.
sure, sure. My friend and colleague Richard Jean So has done really important work on getting the numbers in terms of race and ethnicity in the history of American publishing at the conglomerates. And he showed that even in the 1990s, this period where there was a lot of talk about literature becoming multicultural, if you actually look at the numbers of who was published, it remained a very, very white industry. It was just that a few names were getting a lot of attention. Your Leslie Marmon Silko, or your Toni Morrison, or your Sandra Cisneros, or your Amy Tan. Were getting attention, which was very good, but that wasn't changing the overall representation of who was being published. Now, Richard and I did a subsequent analysis just from the last few years that we published in the Atlantic magazine in June, where we tried to see if publishers were earnest in 2020, the summer of 2020, during the enormous Black Lives Matter protests, about actually trying to diversify their publishing lists. And we found that they actually made a lot of ground. They're still far from being representative of the actual diversity of this country, but they more than doubled their representation of non-white writers. Non-white writers went from being about 11% of the lists at conglomerate publishers in terms of fiction. I'm just talking about fiction right now. And they went from 11% to 25%. So they more than doubled their share of non-white writers in 4 years, from 2020 to 2024. Now, this is good not just for the sheer numbers of it, it's also good for this question of genre and for what kind of books non-white writers can write, because non-white writers have been confined to very particular genres for a long time. They've been highly encouraged and incentivized to write, say, historical, multicultural family epics, where they're investigating historical trauma, often in a sort of quasi-anthropological way. There's a reason why we see the same kinds of stories from non-white writers over and over again from commercial presses. Commercial presses want to publish, and that's what they ask for. That's what they invite. That's what they choose. But in the last few years, with this proliferation of books by non-white writers, we've seen them experimenting in traditionally white genres like the campus novel or the rock and roll novel. The question now is whether or not we're going to see a backlash to that. And there's a lot of signs to suggest that we are, and that the industry might be moving back to the status quo in terms of whiteness.
Hmm. I find it interesting. I wasn't so aware of like the history also of distribution and the different creative ways actually that the publishing houses look to distribution and how important these, talking about my bookshelf, some of these small paperback books were to just expanding, the market for fiction in places where it had never been before. And then also, making it possible really for authors to be stars. I think, back in Mark Twain's time, he made more money, for his speaking appearances than he ever did as an author. That's what made him a celebrity. So it was kind of a new thing to have these author celebrities. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So the United States, it took a long time for the United States to develop its own strong sense of a national literature, and even longer for it to develop a national literature that was recognized outside of the United States. It was really only, some scholars argue, in the 1930s maybe, that the United States started to develop a reputation as a national literature on the global scene. That's when someone like William Faulkner started to get translated into French and became really influential in Paris, which until the 1930s was really the center of world literary culture. Um, but what happened was that United States also, I mean, it kind of follows along with the economic trajectory of the country. After World War II, when the United States became the large superpower that it became, and it became sort of global economic superpower, that also what came with it was a huge boom for the book industry. And so you have the rapid expansion of the universities, which creates so many more readers. At the same time, you have the creation in the United States of the modern mass market book industry, which was created first in 1939 with pocket books, and all these other companies started to follow very quickly in the 1940s. And these were getting books out into people's hands across America at a scale that had been never anywhere close to that before. Before that, there had been magazines. People would read fiction in the pulp magazines, which would be distributed as mass culture. But books were not mass culture in America until the 1940s. And they made celebrities out of folks. So that's also the era that you see a lot of celebrity writing figures: James Baldwin, Truman Capote, Gore Vidal, Norman Mailer, Susan Sontag. It was a period in the 1950s and 1960s corresponding with the greatest period in the history of American capitalism, that you see this great, like, public appearances, these great public life of American literary figures. And unfortunately, we've been in a period since the 1970s of a little bit of decline, both because of the economic situation for America and the difficulty for producing growth in this country. And also, on top of that, the competition from other media, first from TV and film,
mm.
and then starting in the 1990s from the internet. So, books today are in a challenging situation with so much competition, though the internet has also been the site of the greatest proliferation of writing, because the internet has produced uh, uh, unbelievable bursts of self-publishing through Kindle Direct Publishing and other self-publishing platforms, as well as fan fiction and the very, very popular social media writing site Wattpad.
Which are all also conglomerately owned and operated. But
Well,
so it's interesting to think about how is that similar and how is it different, and maybe that could bring us more towards your conclusion, because you say we're still in this conglomeration, this time of conglomerate publishing. But me as a writer, as I'm considering my options, I now have this other option that they call hybrid publishing, where I think, the author, which it's not new, authors have started presses before in order to, Virginia Woolf or any number of people, in order to get their work published and the work of other writers they admire. So, what does it look like to you, like in the future? If a writer takes on that risk, they still have to be smart then about marketing and distribution and the whole works of it if they hope to at least make their money back.
Yeah, I mean, it's an we're in a period where so many more people want to write actually than want to read. And so it becomes really, really difficult
Mm.
to succeed as a writer because we've got this problem of abundance. There's just an incredible outpouring of writing. So if you're an individual, a single person who's written a book and you want to get people's eyes on your book, it's really hard, and you have an array of options, as you've mentioned. You could go with self-publishing, you could go with a hybrid publisher, you could try to go with a small independent or nonprofit, not all of whom need agents. There are like Hub City, Saraband. They are great small nonprofit presses that have open submission periods where unagented writers can submit directly to the presses, or you can go with a literary agent and see if they can help you place their work. Now, all of these are going to produce very different challenges and require very different kinds of strategy. Um, what I would say to try to, one thing that you can do no matter which of these strategies you want to pursue. And I think the best way to live as a writer in 2024 is to try to build and develop your own sense of organic, creative, artistic, and intellectual community where you are. You should be a reader, you should read a lot, and you should try to figure out what connection there are between the people you read. Do you read um, uh, magazines that have, like, if you read a magazine, see who the editor is there, see who that editor is acquiring, see who those writers are, start to follow those writers, see who they're reading, start to connect with folks. You can write to someone who writes a story that you like and send them a note saying you like it. Almost any writer is going to be happy to receive a note saying that someone enjoyed their work. Start to build your own community of people who you read and who might in turn read you, because you've got a certain kind of elective affinity. You share a same aesthetic. And that way, you'll actually know the editors who you ideally would like to publish with. You can start to pay attention to who are the literary agents who are representing the writers who I like to read. Those are the literary agents who should be on the top of my list, who might want to represent me. And really, any of us who are writers, the if you're not in the 0.001%, you're not going to get read by tens of thousands, let alone hundreds of thousands of people. A great success for almost any of us is to be read by several hundred, maybe at the best several thousand people. And you can start to find those people by building your community organically on the ground where you are today. Then when you write, you try to write for that community. And if several hundred people in that community are reading you, then I think you're living a beautiful aesthetic life.
Well, on that note, maybe you could share here in the audio garden with our audience a few pages from your book.
I'd be happy to. Is there anything you'd like?
Well, I think I've been kind of dominating the direction of this conversation, so I would like you to pick what you would like to focus on.
Okay, sure. Um, just give me one moment.
Take your time.
I really am happy with how the book opens. So if it's okay with you, I'd read a little bit from the opening.
Please do.
It was a Monday in late February 1990, the coldest day of the year. Andre Schifrin, a natty 54-year-old New Yorker, left Random House headquarters in Midtown to plod through the evening crowds. Wind blew down from the Hudson River, tousling his graying red hair, stinging his wide-set mousy eyes. He shivered and pulled his overcoat tighter around himself, heading home to his wife. He had just been fired. For 28 years, he had worked at Pantheon, which his father co-founded and later sold to Random House. This younger Schifrin became Pantheon's editorial director. He petitioned Random House for autonomy, and its executives granted it. He extended his father's cosmopolitan vision, bringing European ideas to the United States. He published John Berger's G, Julio Cortázar's Hopscotch, Marguerite Duras' The Lover, Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum. He published leftist writers Barbara Ehrenreich, Michel Foucault, Ralph Nader, Edward Said, Studs Terkel, E.P. Thompson, who wrote history and theory imagined through the experiences of ordinary people. Schifrin fancied himself a bit of a subversive. After his daughters encouraged him to acquire his FBI file, which noted a trip of his to Cuba and his protests against the Vietnam War, he wrote a jocular essay for the New York Times, suggesting that the Bureau's surveillance adds some dignity and meaning to our efforts, to those who fear that no one has paid any attention. By all means, let us pay for more scissors and paste, more files and more agents. How nice to know that someone outside the family will clip our every word. Rumor of Schifrin's firing caught the wind, which carried it through the city. A notice appeared in the next day's Times. It spurred the kind of convergence of energies that we recognize in retrospect as an event. In coming days, Pantheon's editorial staff quit en masse. Opinion pieces were written, protests were held. In one way or another, this event touched everyone in the book world. The firing of Andrei Schifrin revealed that a monumental shift had taken place, one that had begun 30 years earlier, that everyone had watched unfold in slow motion, had tried some of them in fits and starts to stop, but no one, not even the old giants, could stop it now. It would pull everyone into its vortex, dominating the creation of literature for the next 30 years and more.
Dan Sinykin, author of Big Fiction: How Conglomeration Changed the Publishing Industry and American Literature, on Columbia University Press. I want to thank you very much for the time you've spent with me here in the audio garden. I have a couple more questions for you, unrelated to the book, if you have a few minutes.
Sure.
One is kind of putting you on the spot, just asking you to give me a sentence or two with the words "listen and be heard."
Listen and be heard. Sentences with listen and be heard.
A statement, sentence, however you want to do it. You can be creative. There's not any straight rules here.
Uh, find the artists you love, take to the street, spread the news so they can listen and be heard.
That's great. Thank you. And the other thing, I think you're living in Atlanta, Georgia. Is that right?
Correct.
We have this thing about banning books going on all around the country, and I wonder what your experience is there in Georgia and what you think about the phenomenon in general.
Well, I'm very lucky to be in Emory University, which is one of the world's great universities, and in Atlanta, which is a relatively liberal and democratic city. So in my immediate environs, I am blessed to not have to be subject directly to many book bans. But of course, they are proliferating around the country. And with the election of Donald Trump, we are more likely to see more book bans in the coming years. I think it's contemptible. I think people who are banning books are demonstrating that they're afraid. They're afraid of the free circulation of ideas. And every time they ban a book, I hope that we raise the name of that book so that it sells more copies than it ever would have had it not been banned in the first place.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks once again for joining us here in the audio garden. My guest has been Dan Sinykin. How can people learn more about you, get in touch, buy your book? Is there some way you would like them to correspond with you about the book?
Yeah, sure. So I would encourage anyone to go to your local bookstore if they don't carry the book at the moment. Some still do. You can ask them to special ed order it for you. I really think supporting our local independent bookstores is vital right now. You can also find me, you can find my email address at Emory's English Department website, and I would welcome email messages. And I'm also on social media, increasingly more often on Blue Sky than X these days.
I keep hearing about Blue Sky. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan Sinykin. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.